Into the Dust, the Creature of Baja. The Baja 1000 takes place in the desert on the Baja Peninsula. It is the most prestigious off-road race in the world, but it is also one of the most dangerous, especially for motorcycle riders like myself. The distance is grueling enough, but racers are also constantly combating fatigue from riding for hours straight through the course of multiple days. While there are different classes and divisions for the race, all the racers compete at the same time on the same course, making motorcyclists the most vulnerable. If the constant threat of being crushed by 2,000-ton vehicles wasn't enough, spectators will often intentionally interfere with the course by making steep ramps, obstacle courses, and even fire pits to cause havoc for the racers. But none of that danger compares in the slightest of ways to the horrors that I experienced when I last competed. I had competed in the race once before, so I wasn't a rookie, but I wasn't even close to placing the first time. Having a few wins at other competitions under my belt now, and having placed fourth in the Baja 500, the second time I entered the Baja 1000 I entered with the expectation of at least coming in the top 10. The race started like any other off-road race. I pulled out toward the front early and maintained a position close to the front until darkness fell. Night in the desert is colder than most people realize, so I had to battle to stay awake and also stay warm. I was in the middle of thinking about taking a quick nap when I saw that the main course a little ways ahead had been booby-trapped by spectators. One of the riders had apparently wrecked his bike, and as a result other riders were deviating from the course in the hopes to avoid the trap. I decided to do the same. I tried to make a shallow bend, but an ATV boxed me out and I had to go further to the right than I had planned. Just as I was rounding the end of the turn to head back toward the main path, the desert sand dropped away and I fell head over wheels. I flipped one full circle and landed on my tires with a thud in a mound of sand. The drop wasn't very far, but it was enough momentum to drive my head into the handlebars. The impact made my ears ring, despite the fact that my helmet absorbed most of the impact, and I tipped over into the sand. I groaned for a moment before jumping to my feet as thoughts of finishing the race flooded my mind. The hole I'd fallen through was smaller than I'd expected, about the size and shape of a pickup truck. I sighed and realized the only way I'd reach the hole to climb out was if I found something to stand on. Letting out an exasperated sigh, I realized there was no way I'd be able to get my bike out without help. The race was over for me. Somebody help! I screamed at the top of my lungs, but the sound of revving engines and wheels kicking up sand was all I received as a reply. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight to survey the hole I had fallen through, realizing it was supported by some sort of chiseled stone. As I continued to examine the area, I realized I was looking at a ceiling. My survey allowed me to conclude that I was in a larger structure that had been swallowed by the desert. The sand on the ground was at least a few feet deep, and the walls were covered with Aztec-like carvings and symbols. As far as I knew, Aztecs hadn't lived on the Baja Peninsula, but I was no historian. In the distance I saw two circles of light pointed at the wall. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone. The two circles were headlights. Someone else had fallen through. I circumspectly headed toward the headlights, checking the ground for hazards. When I reached my destination, I discovered a trophy truck had indeed fallen into the hole. The vehicle had 3 large gashes along the passenger side, and the door had been ripped away. I initially assumed this had somehow happened during the crash, but when I saw a trail of blood leading from the driver's side, out the door, and away from the vehicle, my heart started to beat faster. As I moved away from the hole I had fallen through, the area grew quieter and quieter. Pretty soon I could barely hear the raspy breaths of someone or something else. I thought about running back to the hole and trying to climb out, but the thought of an injured person needing my help pushed me to continue. The further I went from the trophy truck, the wider the room became until I could no longer see the walls. The breathing grew louder and raspier, as if sand had entered the person's or thing's lungs and was interfering with each breath. When I found the driver of the truck, I froze dead in my tracks. He was hoisted upside down above a stone platform, supported by one of his legs. The supporting leg had been forcibly wedged between 2 narrow stones, and it was obvious the leg would no longer be usable even if I managed to free him. Directly below his head was a stone jar. Every second or so a couple drops of his blood dripped into the jar. It was half full. The raspy breathing continued. Beside the jar was an old, unrolled scroll that had been smeared with lines of blood. A few rolled up scrolls were beside it. On the open scroll was a large triangle. At the top of the triangle was a jar. At the bottom left of the triangle was a disembodied mouth with the tongue pointing down from between the teeth. At the bottom right of the triangle was a man with all his limbs bent outward. At the center of the triangle was a scorpion. I saw the upside-down guy take a breath, and it put a rock in my gut. The breath sounded normal. The raspy breathing continued to reach my ears, and I turned my head to find the source. There on the ground a few feet away, half buried in the sand, was a human head. The one eye above the sand glared at me. Shocked at first, I did nothing, but the guy hoisted above the platform took another breath and I reached up to free him. My attempts to free the guy roused him from his dazed state and he started screaming, looking up at his leg and screaming louder still. "Get me out of here, man," the guy said in between cries of agony. Almost on cue with the end of his sentence, the half-buried head jerked up so that the entire head was above the sand. Both eyes glared at me now, and the mouth parted to speak, freezing me in place. "On el polvo." The voice was as raspy as the breaths it had been taking, and each word expelled a cloud of dust from the mouth and nose. I stared blankly back at it. The head seemed to recognize my confusion, opening its mouth to speak again. "Into the dust." As the last word came out, the head began to rise. The neck was exposed, and I expected a body to follow shortly thereafter. Instead, the neck just kept going. The head moved forward a little and I took a step back as the head and neck continued to extend toward the dangling guy. The neck finally stopped extending and the torso pushed through the sand. It was identical to a normal human torso, except the arms bent backwards at the joint, and the legs did as well. When the creature was fully exposed, I could see that in place of the crotch was a set of large jaws, and situated on both the elbow and knee joints were large pincers. My mind instantly reminded me of the image of the scorpion at the center of the triangle. By now the dangling guy was sobbing hysterically, and I felt tears welling into my eyes as the thought of gruesomely dying crossed my mind as well. Still connected by slender, grotesque limbs of sorts, the pincers on both knees extended. They reached out, and the flat ends pressed against either side of the dangling man, squeezing more blood from his body. The dangling man gave a pained grunt. Into the dust. I turned tail and ran. I heard no signs of pursuit, but I still surprised myself and hopped so high out of the hole in the ceiling when I made it back that my abdomen was on the ground of the Baja Desert. I heaved myself the rest of the way out and ran toward the crowd of spectators, screaming bloody murder like a small child. That wasn't a good feeling. It was a Litigo, where me and my friend decided to play some stupid game. I think it's called Red Door Yellow Door or something of the sorts. After his turn we ended up eyeing me next. I saw a weird room. It was completely red and vibrant. It was eerie, but manageable to walk inside. I tried my best to keep my mind blank and pay attention as that's what the website said, and I ended up opening a very dark door, and it had the drama faces. Frown and smile, and I opened it. It was fucking terrifying. For me at least. There was a large face, kinda like the Mandela catalog kind of faces. It charged at me, which wasn't fun. My friend had to literally slap me to get up. It wasn't a good feeling. The doll blinked. I was around 7 or 8 when I got this pretty doll for Christmas. It had a nice pink dress with a matching bow in its hair. It had brown wavy hair kinda like mine. The next night after I got the doll I was playing in the corner of my room with the doll. My dad was on the balcony which is right next to my room. I stood up to leave the room when I looked back at the doll. It looked at me and blinked. I stood there for about 3 seconds which felt the hours before I ran out onto the balcony. My dad looked at me and said, "What?" I said back in a scared voice, "The doll blinked." "Oh, you probably imagined it. Just stop. I haven't played with that doll in years and I hope to never play with it again." Short. I went to my doctor's for a regular checkup and he examined me as normal. He sat back in his chair and smiled sweetly as he started writing. "Do you feel okay, Daniel? You seem a little anxious." I look at him with a blank expression, as I sit there as tight as a board, and nod. He hands me the paper folded and says, "Go take this to the pharmacy." His sweet smile somewhat comforts me, but my heart drops as I see the note reads, "I see it staring at me over your shoulder. Recluse's fate." I thought that one day my father's repressed thoughts would eventually cause the shape of his head to deform, filling up the limited space of his mind until his skull cracked and exploded onto the 4 dimensions of his room. Countless paranoid sentences would turn it into a papier-mâché cocoon, sticking to every surface like a stain. The patterns and colors he had once curated to camouflage himself in would now be exposed to his true color, a painful red, decorated with unreadable black typefaces that resembled newspaper cutouts of sensationalist tragedies. I wonder how those crumpled up pieces of his mind would read now that his failing memory had filtered them into single words. I'm scared to bring a child into this world, he would have thought, though scared, world, and child were all that was left. Instead, his room was empty, and like an unfinished sentence, he was gone. His presence was scattered in the form of a neglected car in the driveway and the unanswered phone on the kitchen counter. It wasn't like he used his phone anyway, he was always cut off from the rest of the world. It's safer that way, he'd tell me, though only now, as I searched for him in the forest that secluded our home, did I question how this could be safer. I thought about the different sentences those stray words of his could form, the dregs left by the rain flipping me onto my back. The dark earth savored me on its wet tongue, interrupting my thoughts with a sharp silence. I savored it too, staring at the moon as if the sky watched me back with one eye open, near blind and milky white with not a single thought behind it. A nightmarish voice filled the air, though no shape stood out as the forest silhouette cut through the moon's light. It sounded like someone had recorded my father calling my name, playing it back through the mouth of something that wasn't human. I sat up, too afraid to discover the origin of that poor mimicry, and tried to stand, the weight of my body flipping onto its side as the sludge swept up my feet again. I felt like a child being knocked over, embarrassed and terrified as the mud covered my face. I tried again, turning my body over and lifting my weight, wobbling and balancing like a newborn calf, anxious to discover its bleak fate. I made one last adjustment to my stance, finding stable footing as my feet slid apart. Every direction repeated itself just as the sound did, and the light from my flashlight was not enough to pinpoint the difference between the asymmetrical trees. Creatures watched from above, turning to branches and twigs as I exposed them to my light until one slipped into obscurity. I turned away and tried to push uphill, but the earth was starving, and as I fell for the last time, I realized I had run out of time to ask hopeless questions. No, I could only answer, grabbing fists of dirt as I attempted to claw my way in any direction. Adrenaline made the noise unbearable as it became louder, but not closer. Starved, self-indulgent groans filled my head as a thin, long-fingered hand crawled up my leg, the sharp tips of those digging their way into my skin as it dragged me towards the sound that felt disembodied from its limb. One thing was certain, the sun will rise soon, and alongside it, the folk call of a bird. I fear that others may hear that thing using my helpless cries to draw them in, for I cannot describe what they may find. Alongside many other regrets, I feel that I should have stayed inside, isolating myself like my father always did, but now it does not matter, for I am nothing but what he is, and always will be. Who was that? So it was a nice day outside and this happened a few months ago and I got up and did my chores because I have to. So I made me something to eat and I went to sit on my couch to watch some TV. So when I went to my room I stayed playing some games when my mom and the rest of my family left the house to go somewhere and they didn't tell me that until I walked back into the living room to find nobody in the house and our car is gone. So I went back into my room sitting there and then continued to play some games, until someone called my name. It was my mom's voice but she left the house. I checked everywhere to see if someone was messing with me but nobody was there. I sat there more curious than frightened. Luckily nothing like this ever happened again and still till this day I wondered how something like that could happen. Hi. Every night before going to sleep I hear in the darkness of my room a group of kids giggling and when they noticed I was awake they just stared and all told me separately to go hide. I always hid under my covers. Sometimes I cry here with the children getting closer telling me to hide tonight. I found out why. That night I was tired and naive when the children told me to go hide. I stood my ground and kept on looking at them as they one at a time came closer to me telling me to hide, then they all went away. A tick was all around my room and from my closet I heard a very raspy and deep voice say ready or not here I come. I jumped up from my bed and ran to our living room closet where all the coats and winter cloths. I heard my parents scream in fear and agony. I don't know how long I've been in here but sometimes I randomly hear him say I found you very close to the closet. Do you know what happens to naughty little brothers? That's what it said on the poster anyways. Slightly annoyed at the improper grammar or I should say lack of punctuation as an English major, I was more concerned as I had a snobby annoying bitch as a baby brother. Dismissing its mysterious nature, I continued down the road to my house. I only walked a few steps when I heard it being said. Do you know what happens to naughty little brothers? It even sounded grammatically incorrect verbally. I suddenly realized that it was 4:03 p.m. and practically no one walks on this street at this time. Turns out I was wrong. I turned around, there was no one behind me, yet. First, it was quiet, I heard it about once every 10 seconds. Then, it started getting louder and more frequent. I turned around yet once more, and what I saw at the top of the hill, I will remember forever.